The day Dr. Julian Foster announced to the world that he had developed the treatment for early-stage Alzheimer's, using research I had emailed him 3 days before he locked me out of our lab. I was sitting in a rented studio apartment with $843 in my bank account and a cease and desist letter prohibiting me from discussing proprietary Helix biotech methodologies. But what Julian didn't know as he accepted applause on that gleaming stage was that I had kept one crucial component of the protocol to myself: the enzyme stabilizer that would prevent the treatment from degrading after 6 months. And I was about to teach him what happens when you steal from the person who actually knows how the science works. My name is Dr. Nora Chin, and this is how I turned scientific betrayal into the greatest medical breakthrough of the century. 14 hours after Julian's announcement, while Helix Biotech's stock soared and champagne flowed in boardrooms, I sat across from Amara Okafor, founder of Genesis Medical Ventures, in a quiet corner of a hotel restaurant. "They'll come after you with everything they have," Amara warned, studying the molecular diagrams I presented. "Helix has an army of lawyers. They can only come after me for what they know exists," I replied, turning to the final page of my presentation. "And Julian Foster has no idea what he's missing." The science was elegant in its simplicity, a treatment for Alzheimer's that targeted the tau protein tangles in their earliest formation. Julian's version would show impressive initial results, but within 6 months, the protein inhibitor would break down, allowing the disease to progress. Without my stabilization protocol, what Helix announced was essentially an expensive temporary treatment, not the revolutionary therapy they claimed. "If what you're showing me is accurate," Amara said slowly, "Helix has just committed securities fraud on a massive scale." "It's accurate," I confirmed. "I spent 7 years developing this approach. Julian was my postdoc advisor. He provided funding and took credit, but the science is mine." Amara closed the folder. "Why come to me? There are larger biotech firms that could develop this faster." "Because you're the only CEO in biotech who was once a research scientist herself. You understand what Julian did isn't just theft, it's a violation of everything science stands for." Her eyes, sharp and assessing, held mine. "And revenge? Is that part of your motivation, Dr. Chen?" "Justice," I corrected. "For myself, yes, but also for the patients who deserve the complete treatment, not the flawed version Julian is rushing to market." 3 days later, I became Genesis Medical's newest research director with a fully equipped lab and a team of scientists who hadn't been told my history with Helix. Amara had insisted on that condition. What we were developing would stand on its scientific merit, not as a referendum on Julian Foster's ethics. The work was exhilarating, free from Julian's constant interference and credit grabbing. I refined the stabilization protocol, making it more effective than my original design. My team, brilliant researchers who had been overlooked by larger companies because they didn't fit the typical profile of corporate scientists, brought fresh perspectives that accelerated our progress. 4 months into our work, just as we prepared for preliminary trials, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. "Nora?" Julian's voice carried its familiar condescending tone. "I think it's time we talked about your departure from Helix." I stepped into the hallway away from my team. "What's there to discuss, Julian? You locked me out of my lab, claimed my research as your own, and threatened legal action if I spoke about it." "Water under the bridge," he said dismissively. "Our initial trials are showing excellent results. The board has approved a conciliatory package for your contributions, $2 million and a senior researcher position. Under my supervision, of course." Of course. Because even when offering what he thought was an olive branch, Julian couldn't help but assert his dominance. "Why the sudden generosity?" I asked, though I already knew. The 6-month mark was approaching, when his version of the treatment would begin to fail. "Let's call it professional courtesy," he replied smoothly, "and the recognition that your background knowledge might prove useful as we move toward full clinical trials." My background knowledge, a delicate way of saying he'd discovered there were gaps in the research he'd stolen. "I'm flattered, Julian, but I'm quite happy at Genesis Medical." A pause. Genesis, that little startup. What could they possibly offer that compares to Helix? Integrity. I replied simply, "But I wish you luck with your trials. I'm sure they're going exactly as designed." I ended the call, smiling at the implied threat. Julian was smart enough to hear it. the suggestion that his trials were proceeding according to a design he didn't fully understand. 2 weeks later, it began. Reports from Helix's clinical trials showed unexpected complications. Patients whose initial improvements were reversing as the treatment degraded. Helix's stock dropped 15% in a single day. Julian made reassuring statements about normal refinement of breakthrough treatments, but the damage was done. Amara appeared in my lab doorway, tablet in hand. Helix just announced they're delaying their FDA application. Apparently, they need to enhance the longevity of therapeutic effects. What a surprise, I murmured, not looking up from my microscope. Their lawyers are asking questions, Nora, about your employment here, about what you might have taken from Helix. Now I did look up. I took nothing but my own intellectual property, the parts Julian didn't even realize existed because he never bothered to understand the science. Everything we're developing here is new work, built on my original theoretical framework. Amara nodded, satisfied. Good, because we're ready to announce our own clinical trials next month. The complete treatment protocol. The press conference announcing Genesis Medical's comprehensive approach to early Alzheimer's intervention was deliberately low-key. I presented the science without fanfare, emphasizing the stabilization mechanism that would prevent degradation of the treatment effects. I never mentioned Helix or Julian, but I didn't have to. Every scientific journalist in attendance understood the implications. By the end of the day, Helix Biotech's stock had fallen another 20%, and Julian was facing pointed questions about whether he had deliberately misrepresented his research. That evening, as I reviewed preliminary patient data, my security badge buzzed me into the building. A figure rose from the waiting area in the darkened lobby, Julian looking haggard in a rumpled suit. You planned this, he said without preamble. You knew the treatment would fail after 6 months. I knew the incomplete treatment would fail, I corrected. The one you took from my research without understanding all the components. You deliberately withheld critical information. From whom, Julian? The research was mine. I simply hadn't completed documenting the stabilization protocol when you decided to lock me out and claim my work as your own. He ran a hand through his graying hair. The board is considering removing me as research director. Investors are threatening lawsuits. My reputation is suffering the consequences of your actions, I finished. That's how scientific integrity works. What do you want, Nora? Money? Your name on the Helix patent? A public apology? Name it. I studied the man who had been my mentor, who had taught me as much about the politics of science as he had about molecular biology, though not in the way he'd intended. I want you to withdraw the Helix treatment from trials and acknowledge it's incomplete, I said. I want you to admit publicly that the research originated with me. That would destroy everything I've built. No, Julian, it would restore what you attempted to steal. His face darkened. Our lawyers will fight this. We'll claim you took proprietary research to Genesis. You're welcome to try, but ask yourself, do you actually understand the science well enough to explain to a court what specific proprietary elements I supposedly took? Because I understand every molecule, every mechanism, every interaction. Do you? The question hung between us. We both knew the answer. Julian had built his career taking credit for others' work, positioning himself as the visionary while relegating the actual scientists to the background. The board meets tomorrow, he said finally. I'll present the options. 3 days later, Helix Biotech issued a statement. They were halting their Alzheimer's treatment trials and entering a research partnership with Genesis Medical Ventures to develop a more comprehensive therapeutic approach. Julian Foster would be transitioning to an advisory role. The press release didn't mention me by name, but it didn't matter. Within the scientific community, the message was clear. 6 months later, our combined clinical trials showed what I had known all along. The complete protocol, with the stabilization mechanism properly integrated, showed unprecedented results. Early-stage Alzheimer's patients demonstrated not just halted progression, but actual reversal of symptoms. On the day the New England Journal of Medicine published our results, Amara found me in the lab, working late as usual. The FDA fast-tracked our approval application, she announced, and the Genesis board voted unanimously on the expanded research program you proposed. I looked up from the genetic sequences I was reviewing, the preliminary work for what I hoped would be a preventative protocol, not just a treatment. Any word from Helix? I asked. Julian resigned last week. Word is he's taking a position at a small university research department. She smiled slightly. Teaching ethics in scientific research, ironically. I returned to my work, feeling neither satisfaction nor vindication. The past year had taught me that the real victory wasn't in Julian's downfall, but in the work itself, in creating something that would help millions of people, in building a research team that valued scientific integrity above personal advancement. Dr. Okafor. A young researcher appeared in the doorway, clutching a tablet. The new T-cell response data you asked for. Amara gestured her inside. Dr. Chen should see this too. Marina was just telling me about her theory on enhanced neuroplasticity in conjunction with our treatment. The young woman, barely out of her PhD program, nervously outlined her hypothesis, gaining confidence as both Amara and I asked questions and offered suggestions rather than dismissals. This could be a significant extension of the protocol, I said when she finished. Would you like to develop a research proposal for a pilot study? Her eyes widened. You let me lead that project. Not let you, Amara corrected. Ask you, because it's your insight, your theory. Later, after Marina had excitedly departed to begin working on her proposal, Amara lingered in my lab. You know, when you first came to me, I thought you were primarily motivated by settling scores with Julian and Helix. I smiled. That was part of it, I admitted. I'm not above wanting justice. But that's not what drives you now. No, I gestured toward the lab where several researchers were still working despite the late hour. What Julian never understood is that scientific advancement isn't about individual glory. It's about building on each other's work, about creating knowledge that outlasts any single career. Amara nodded toward Marina's workstation. You're mentoring her very differently than Julian mentored you. Breaking cycles is as important as breaking scientific ground, I replied. Maybe more so. The following spring, as the first patients received our FDA-approved treatment outside of clinical trials, I received a package, a scientific journal with a post-it marking a small article about Julian Foster's new research into ethical scientific collaboration. The note, in Amara's handwriting, simply read, **, sometimes the best revenge is becoming the mentor you wish you'd had **. I pinned the article to my bulletin board, not as a reminder of past betrayal, but as evidence that systems can change, sometimes one scientist, one mentor, one breakthrough at a time. Because the true legacy of scientific work isn't measured in patents or stock prices or even Nobel Prizes. It's measured in lives improved, in knowledge advanced, and in the next generation of scientists who learn not just how to conduct research, but how to conduct themselves. That's a protocol worth perfecting.